you see way up in the sky? Making circles in the morning sun, flying high in the sky till the day is done. I can't break away. Like a child in his fantasy, punching holes in the walls of reality. All my life I wanted to fly, but I don't have the wings, and I wonder why I can't break away. Oh, well, Mama told me when I was young, stand tall, girl, you're number one. But you can be what you wanna be, but you can't change the course of your destiny. I can't break away. Well, no, I can't break away. I can't break away. No, I can't break away. I can't break away.
Greetings, my excellent friend.
So we're going to have to make the text a little bit smaller on that alert so the names will fit. Good to know. Think anything of the host as well as, let's see, Draken Rocket resubs, Manny at tier 3, 12 months, Turi, 11 months, Dustin somehow alerted twice, Rocket with the bits, thank you very much, 100 bits. Let's see, who'd I miss? Dustin somehow got the resub alert twice. I gotta make that text smaller. Well, that's good to know. Make the box bigger, one of the two. Alright. So, let's get some things out of the way real quick. First and always, the disclaimer, I am not a historian. For those of you watching on YouTube, I am a well-read student of history. And you can get the sources by showing up in the channel for a live stream and hitting exclamation point sources and seeing where I draw all my information from. Five Fists, welcome in. Good to see you. The second thing is corrections. Nothing really wrong last week, but I did flub June, July a few times. And part of that was because something was said and I was at a different point in a train of thought. So if you're going to ask if I'm accurate, please provide the context in your, are you sure you meant this specifically? Don't just fire a month off of me, because it totally threw me in the left field for a minute. And we got back on track and I corrected it, but it's not really going to matter this week because everything is going to happen in 2 whole weeks of July. That's all we're talking about tonight.
My lord, yourself.
Cat, what's up? Welcome in. Yeah, someone put a quarter on the rail in my mental train. That's exactly what happened. Well, that's not supposed to be me, but it's because it's anonymous. Dirty little hamster with the savory gift subs. That can't be right. I have to fix the way these look. Here we go. That's a bunch of them. It says me. So I have to make that box a little bit bigger. That's all I know. We'll do that after. Poe gets one. Let's see who's in there. Marcus, Argo, Pro Ref Jeremy, Laydown Clowns, CF Live, Nymphsomniac, Master Poe, Chewbacca, King 7, Dirty Little Hamster. They all get them. I thought I had that turned off so that only the gift giver would pop. But we'll make sure we fix that during the week this week as well. We'll just let him play. Argo, welcome in. Argo got to get his mug. Loud noises. Should be fairly well balanced, actually. Now it needs filled, indeed. Here comes Sturf, giving out gift subs. To Tux Racer. Said I can't pronounce her new name. Civil Rights, Kiba. Try there it is. Now we go. It is just ribbon. There we go. All right, so we're all through all the gift subs. Thank you very much. We just hit a level 5 hype train. For those of you that are new to the channel and don't hang out that much, or you're starting to hang out with us now, all of the gift sub, all the sub revenue after I pay taxes on it goes to disabled American veterans. That is how you support the channel. As we roll into tonight's stream, the maps are something I'm starting to pay for because the high quality maps I want to use, they're about $3 to $5 a piece. Some go as high as 20. So it sounds like the alert reduction works on name subs and not the anonymous ones. Yeah, that seems to be the case. There's nothing I'm going to be able to do about that, I don't think. Just because it's reading me as it, I don't know, I'll look into it. I'm on the right track with the alerts. They're up in the corner. They're out of the way of the map for the most part. And we'll go from there. But the gift subs bits, all that goes to Disabled American Veterans, which is a charity near and dear to my heart and several others in the channel. I actually will give you the total for this month's donation, the June donation, next week. No worries, Gilly. Just pop me a reminder. It's the best way for me to see it. Yeah, Anonymous shows the streamer and Firebot. It's weird. But anyway, back to the point of the nickel on my brain train last week. You're right, and that won't really matter this week because we're only going to talk about basically 2 weeks in history this week. It is the longest outline I have ever written by a page, and it covers the shortest amount of time.
That's what's kicking the balls. Is that enough payment?
Thanks, Billy. Welcome in, Mads. So, one of the other things that is going to happen tonight is, as we look at the board, there is a new section on top. Who's dead and who's emigrated. Now, emigrating means they've left France, right? They've gone elsewhere. They've gotten out of here. And you'll remember during our discussion on Charles Calonne that he was, like, getting burned in effigy. And whenever Brienne took over, and he's like, peace out, I'm no longer going to hang out. And he went to England. He would come back under the auspices of Napoleon and, die about a month later in, the early part of the 19th century. On mobile, that's why. That makes sense. So, tonight, we're going to cover the most famous event in the French Revolution, and we're going to dissect why it probably shouldn't be. The fall of that Bastille is celebrated as a national holiday in France, and once we get to the end of this, you might hopefully be scratching your head as to why this is the big event. I still think the formation of the National Assembly is a bigger deal. Squirrel, welcome in, but we'll get to it. So, when we left off last week, the National Assembly had formed, and the king had had that royal session where he took that hard line, and the Third Estate delegates said, no, sir, we're not leaving. And the Comte de Mirabeau, among others, stood up. Diggity. The Comte de Mirabeau stood up and said, you're basically going to have to come and get us out of here at gunpoint. And over the course of a couple of days, the king capitulates and says, okay, everybody meet under the auspices of this National Assembly. Come together and meet there. And that's where we are in early July 1789. The king has ordered all three estates to come together, meet, and legislate together. And a lot of people at the time thought that's that, right? That's the end of the revolution's over. We got what we wanted. The Third Estate has its double the third. It has its vote by head, and we're good to go. I have no idea why that just popped up there. That's interesting. Oh, probably because it couldn't cloud connect. So they thought, hey, that's it. The revolution's done, right? Well, the revolution's just getting started, and it hasn't entered into anywhere near its bloodiest phase, but it will get a little bloody tonight. So for the individual we had a timeout last week, this is the week. This is when people start dying. So anyway, the big thing is everything we talked about last week happens at Versailles, right? Which is, southwest of Paris, big kind of city castle onto its own, and all the aristocrats and the members of the National Assembly and the courtiers are there, and this is completely detached from that for the most part. It happens in the wake of the National Assembly becoming the National Assembly, but everything we're going to talk about this week largely happens in Paris. So, the harvest. We're going to come back to the bread and the harvest. The harvest of 1787, remember, was due to crop devastation in areas of the country, and it led to a significant grain shortage, and then we had another bad one in 1788. Its food stocks in the summer of 1789 were really low. People were under a free grain system at this point where they were paying market cost. And that's when we were talking about, instead of paying 20 to 40% of their income on food, they were paying, 60% to upwards of 90% of that income on food. So you have a population of the city of Paris that is just starving because they can't afford to buy food, the most basic of food. The bread prices are as high at this point in time in Paris as they have been since, if you remember from way back when we talked about the Flour War, when there was actual riots over bread in 1775. It's the highest they've been since then. And the 1st of July there were these really weird, some historians categorize them as biannual, meaning twice yearly, and some categorize them as quarterly. And I've seen them occur in July and in October, so I go with quarterly. There were these quarterly deadlines to remediate your debts, meaning pay your rent if you were past due. So we're rolling into July when people cannot afford to pay for food and they're being told, pay your back rent. And then this other thing starts happening. Troops start to slowly, over the period of a few weeks, ever since things really went off the rails at Versailles, troops start to roll into Paris. Because Paris is the hotbed of radicalism. So troops start to be slowly trickled, and then this is regulars. This is army regular troops, not National Guardsmen. This is the true French army regulars start to be redeployed to the city. And everyone notices. I mean, every peasant, everyone in the city notices that this troop presence around them is increasing. And it goes from like 4,000 troops before really things went down in Versailles to about 20,000 troops by the second week of July. So the thing is this was done without the king really knowing about it. And during the opening credits, you saw me say, the queen maybe wasn't grieving as hard as the king was over the death of the Dauphin, because it was Queen Marie Antoinette and the king's brother, Charles Philippe, the Comte d'Artois, who were working behind the king's back to up the troop levels in Paris. So the two individuals you see up here at the top, they are working to put troops into Paris. So most people who lived in Paris, especially the common people, seeing this troop buildup, they were effectively expecting that the monarchy was about to drop the hammer, that the response from the crown to the basic political rebellion that had occurred with the National Assembly was going to be military action against everybody. So, if you remember, in June, when Necker wasn't present for that royal session, there were riots all over the place. And the responding units were guard units. They were, more local units, kind of like the National Guard, if you want to equate it to your modern, comparison. These were people that, had a day job, but put on a uniform to, police and defend internally and externally the nation and the Kingdom of France. But the units that were being pushed in now are not those guard units. They are regulars. And the regulars are being put in because those guard units mutinied. Remember, they were like, no, we're not going to follow that order. Whenever they were told to put down some of the riots in Paris, the guard units refused those orders. So the regular army units are the ones being brought in. We're going to get to what happened to some of those mutinying guard units here in a little bit, because something did happen to them and it's important, but in time we'll get there. So, on June 30th, 4,000 Parisians, 4,000 common everyday sans-culottes of Paris march on the prison where some of the mutinied soldiers are being kept. They push their way into the prison, and made off with the guardsmen. They get into the prison, they get through the gates, and they free the guardsmen who had refused to shoot on them. Basically shoot on them, refused to break up their riot, refused every order they were given that day in June. And then once the guardsmen were taken out of the prison, they were moved around because the authorities started looking for them because they were I guess in this point in time, justice is a weird thing, but they were assumed to be, criminals. So the Parisians were moving these guardsmen around, refusing to let the authorities catch up with them. And there's this emerging leadership separate from the National Assembly, still formulated by members of the bourgeoisie, and they are the Paris electors. And who the Paris electors are is, if you remember, when we are electing delegates to the National Assembly, the assemblies had to elect electors who would then elect who would go, right? And for much of the larger constituencies of the Third Estate, for all of the constituencies of the Third Estate. So when those assemblies' purpose was done, they disbanded, right? They were done. Not in Paris. The Paris electors said, you know what? We should stay convened. And they operated as a shadow government behind the scenes, trying to get a hold of events in Paris. There is no mayor of Paris yet. There will be shortly. There's no police of Paris. That'll happen eventually. But the notions that we have civically of cities and towns having this small rooted governments, they chose to not disband their assembly, and they started meeting kind of like all these other clubs we've talked about, like the Britain Club, who would become the Jacobins down the road. These groups of delegates who started meeting after hours. The Paris electors start meeting during the day at the Hotel de Ville, which is right in the middle of your map on the Seine, right across from Notre Dame. They start meeting during the day. They start coming up with, well, if we were in charge, here's the policy we would do. And they start observing events. And they start going, what's going on with these soldiers being moved around is, we're asking for it, right? We've now effectively poked the crown in the eye pretty hard as a city. And if they weren't going to drop the hammer before, they sure probably are now. And so what they did is they reached a compromise with the crown. This group of no official purpose whatsoever, their purpose is done. Paris electors work at compromise with the crown because they know how to figure out where the guardsmen are, and they say, sure, we're going to return the guardsmen to the king, to the authorities. They're going to spend one night in jail, and that's it. And they were released the next day, and that was the compromise. So the king got to save face. The ministry gets to save face by saying, yep, we decided to let them go. Even though behind the scenes, the Paris electors had worked out the compromise. So following this storming of a prison to get the guardsmen who defended the people effectively out of jail, and then giving them back to the king, and then the king saying, yeah, I'm going to release them because that's the terms of the deal. Billy was the crown, not the king. The troops continue to pour in. The thing about the troops, though, is they weren't all French, because the French army couldn't spare that many regulars from the frontier. You can't take 20,000 troops off the line in basic defensive positions, because we've talked about how the politics of Europe have just been on a seesaw for 40 years, with alliances changing, and you don't know who your friend is after which war. They can't just take 20,000 troops off the line. So they hire mercenaries, even though my question is, where's the money come from that for that? But they hire mercenaries, primarily German and Swiss mercenaries. And so it helps blend into this prevailing conspiracy theory that's going around Paris, that the Queen is actively working with her brother, who is the Holy Roman Emperor, Joseph II, to seize control of France and to kill this democratic movement. So we talked about how there was not this great movement of monarchs to move against the revolution in France, to restore the Bourbons to their power, but people were they were working on conspiracy theories that the Queen was working with her brother, the Holy Roman Emperor, to do just that. So you can kind of see how, over time, throughout the writing of history, how even though she wasn't conspiring with her brother, she was conspiring with her brother-in-law internally, that momentum of rumor begins to permeate into the people.
Remember to clonk that follow button
on history. And so the notion that monarchs rose to defend monarchs becomes almost de facto fact when it's not. So, but the thing is because there were foreign mercenaries in Paris, basically as a security force, it lended credence to the notion that the Queen was working with her Austrian brother, the Holy Roman Emperor, to undermine and take away the democratic movement in France. Now, the Queen was definitely trying to do that. Let's be plain. She wanted the crown, or more that the Comte d'Artois, Charles Philippe. They both wanted the crown to take a hard line against what was going on, all this revolutionary activity. But they started the ball rolling without Louis knowing. They started the troop buildup. Eventually, he gets on board behind the scenes, like, yes, we need to do this for the security of the people, blah, blah, blah. But the Queen and the Comte d'Artois really want to just stamp out what is going on and return to the status quo that was before the National Assembly became a thing. So, in the moment, like I said, this conspiracy theory is nonsense. It will become a little closer to what is true over time. The Queen will eventually appeal to her brother for help, but that's not happening right now. All of the European heads of state are looking at France. Remember, France didn't intervene in the Netherlands, and it raised everyone's head because they couldn't financially do it. Brienne said, no, we cannot afford to intervene in the Netherlands with the Prussians being there. And now they're watching this political upheaval occur, and they're going, that's great. France is weak. Weak France means we don't have to put as many resources on the French border. Weak France means maybe one day France folds and we can all have a grab at that territory. But no one next outside of France was like, let's get in there and stop this. That was, at this point in time, no one was doing that. Excuse me. But again, the Queen was working with Charles Philippe, who the Comte d'Artois. He is an important figure as we roll into the Bourbon Restoration after Napoleon. He's going to become a very big deal. And Charles Philippe's primary motivation is, as I said, trying to undermine this revolutionary movement and get things returned to the way they were. So you can kind of put him in the ultra-conservative bucket that we've talked about. He is certainly in that place in the political spectrum. He does not want what is happening to continue to happen. And the Queen doesn't want it to happen because, one, it stabs at her power, and two, it stabs at the security of her family. You know, whenever we have angry peasants rolling around, it does threaten the security of the royal family. And we're going to talk a whole lot more about the direct threat to the royal family next week when we talk about when the citizens of Paris actually march on Versailles. But for now, they just wanted the king to take this hard line. And one of the reasons they wanted to do it is they wanted Necker out. If we go back to who Necker is, he is a commoner, he's a foreigner, and he's a Protestant. So I'll read that in a second, Gilly. But he's a foreigner, a commoner, and a Protestant. And that didn't sit well with either of these two high aristocrats, right? That means the Queen and one of the princes of the blood. And they don't like Necker at all.
No way!
Yes way. Because he just doesn't fit into their mold of whom should be, at this point, he is the Controller General of France. So a lot of narratives I've seen indicate it was more fear-based. The other nations looked at democratic movements in France and didn't want it to occur in their own nations, and that's why they intervened. Nope. That's not why they intervened either. Because they didn't intervene. We're a couple years away from it, Gilly, but they didn't intervene. If you want to know who threw the first blow, it was France. France reached outward looking for a fight. When the Legislative Assembly comes along, once the Constitution, the first Constitution gets written, we'll get into France being a little war hawkish and picking a fight with Austria, and that'll start a whole lot of problems. But none of the European nations looked at France and said, "We will act first," and none of them did. But we'll get there. But anyway, the Queen and Charles Philippe wanted Necker gone. They wanted the king to take this hard line with the revolution. And one of the reasons they were building up troops was because they wanted to have the leverage they needed, necessary, this military leverage present in the city, in order to basically enforce their will. But the thing is Necker, if you go back to when we talked about the things that have reached legend status in France at this point, there are two things. Two things were supposed to fix everything. The States General being called, which is now the National Assembly, and the common folk love that idea, and Necker. Necker was supposed to be the financial savior of France, right? So we're talking early July. The estates haven't done a dang thing with respect to the finances of France, except say all taxes are illegal unless we say so. So the idea that the Queen and the Comte d'Artois are putting Necker in their sights when the everyday person in France, especially in Paris, still views him as like this Perseus type character, this person who's going to be able to cure all ills, is quite frankly out of touch. Because you don't move on someone that popular and expect nothing to happen. They'd been working to undermine him and the lead up to these during the lead up to these States General and the first month of the National Assembly. And this undermining from the Queen and the Comte d'Artois, if you'll remember, when that royal session of the estates occurred and Necker was not present for it, which caused riots, Necker wasn't present because he learned in advance that the king had intended to take a harder line than what they had discussed previously. And that for sure came from the Queen and the Comte d'Artois. That push to be firmer, to take a stand, to convince everybody there of this is my will and that's that came from those two. So whenever Necker wasn't there, and the reaction was, why wasn't he there? Is he fired? Oh my God, they fired Necker. Even though they didn't, he had given his resignation and been convinced to not resign, but he was still there. Remember, they went to Versailles and he stood on the balcony and said, no guys, I'm still here, and it backed the crowds at Versailles down. But in the face of that reaction, Necker being fired even though he wasn't, the Queen and the Comte d'Artois took a step back and said, okay, we can't just politically undermine him. There's the people rising up, like that's a problem. And that's when the troop buildup starts. They have to start building troops up in Paris because the reaction to the not even firing of Necker was an eye-opener with respect to what they expected to happen. Now, and that's the curious thing for me, is because they looked at what happened, right? There were riots all over the place. There were rioters. Well, there was a mob outside Versailles. There were riots that killed people in Paris. They looked at what happened in the wake of not even firing Necker and said, let's try it again. Let's continue to work down to that goal because he's a commoner and a Protestant and a foreigner. It seems to me that their aim should not have been Necker. It should have been, how do we undermine the National Assembly? Because Necker was, there's a term in history called the marble man, where once someone's cast as a statue, the ugliness of whom they are falls off of them. Necker was almost a living marble man to the French people, where they only saw his good qualities. They just saw him as this near savior-like person. So the idea of taking a stab at him twice in a period of 10 weeks seems crazy to me. And eliminating them that can only make a martyr. It's going to be the politics of the revolution will change so quickly that martyrs will be the people who were your allies last week. But we're going to get to that when we get to the Jacobins. So the bread crisis, in addition to everything else we've just described, makes it almost equally as impossible to make a move against Necker. The entire country is facing shortages of bread. There are bread riots in Flanders and Normandy because there's just no food for any of the common people to eat. In Lyon, there were attacks on the toll gates that still regulated some of the trade in and out of the city. There were still toll gates in Paris as well. And the National Assembly takes up the matter, right, of the bread. what are we going to do about the bread? On July 4th through the July 7th. And you have to remember that most of the delegates who were at the National Assembly were men of the Enlightenment, right? These were men that believed in free everything. Free rights for all, free trade. So it's counterintuitive to almost everything they've ever thought and learned that there should be regulation on trade of a precious commodity like food. And so the only person who, part of that is, before I go to the next point, part of the reason the delegates didn't take a step back and go, hey, free trade's a great thing, and this free grain thing is, we need it to happen eventually, but every time we've tried it, it's been a problem. We talked about the inexperience of about 2/3 of the third estate delegates to the National Assembly. That inexperience bubbles up here, where they're unable to separate the theory of enlightenment to the realities of the day to day and say, yeah, we really want to put these theories in place, but we can't live and die by them today because people are dying out there because they can't eat. So the only person, though, who is fighting for absolute price controls on food is Necker. Because if you go way back to episode 1.2, we talked about this, again, this seesaw of people who were free traders, and they wanted to free the grain trade, and Necker was a guy who didn't want that. He's never broken from that. Remember, that was the thing he used to become popular with the people 10 years ago was no, free grain's bad for the people. They're paying too much for it. We need controls on these things. We need to make sure that the grain is, being moved to where it's needed, even if it costs the farmer too much money to do so and they suffer a loss. The people need food, and Necker's never broken that line. So it's another one of those reasons that he is still nearly deified with the people, because he stands up and says, no, look, the people are starving. And the free grain trade has starved them because they can't afford it. So he is not of the Enlightenment thinking in the idea of free trade. He wants to regulate and set price controls on grain, just as he always has. And it's another one of those things where, as the National Assembly is debating it and does nothing, by the way, they come up with no plan because they cannot break out of their Enlightenment thinking. Necker's out there saying the same things he's always said. Price controls on bread will bring the prices down and make it so that people can eat. And that resonates with the people who are currently starving, right? Necker, unfortunately, we talked about how smart was it for the Queen and the Comte d'Artois to take aim at Necker. Even though they had stood there in mid-June and watched the supposed firing of him, late June, the supposed firing of him lead to riots, they believed they had built up enough troops by the 11th of July to convince Louis to fire him. And they did convince Louis to fire Necker on July 11th. And we are 30 minutes into the stream, and now we're talking about 4 days in French history for the rest of the time we're talking tonight. So on July 11th, Louis is convinced by the Queen, the Comte d'Artois, and other arch conservatives in his circle that Necker has to go. Now, Louis doesn't like Necker at all. It's not like they're buddies. He doesn't dislike him for the same reasons that the Queen and the Comte d'Artois don't like him, because if you remember, during the Assembly of Notables, Louis had ordered Necker to shut his mouth. Necker didn't, and then Louis kind of, exiled him for a little while. Louis dislikes him for different reasons. It's not the you're not a lord, you're not a French person. It's none of that. It's not religious based either. It's more of the I'm the king and you didn't listen to me and you're kind of an arrogant prick. And so for his own reasons, the Queen and the Comte d'Artois manipulate that dislike of Necker in Louis. I'll answer that in a second, Gilly. And they use it to get Necker fired. It's been about a month since the Dauphin died, so I would say yes, they're still grieving. But remember, the Queen's been doing all of this since before the Dauphin died. So that's where I say maybe she wasn't as grieved an individual as the king was. And that's all subjective because you cannot measure historically one's emotions. No one knows. No one's ever going to know what they were feeling, right? Unless you have a diary that they wrote firsthand in the moment of events, you're just not going to have a firsthand source that says, well, the Queen really wasn't that upset for whatever reason. But she seems to be not as upset as Louis is, because Louis rolls into the royal session in late June, 3 weeks after the death of his son, still fairly rattled by it. He is. Yeah, he's definitely currently in a really bad headspace with respect to the death of his son, because from the patriarchal perspective of the monarchy, that was the next king, right? In Louis's mind, at his age, the next king of France just died. And that hits that dated but relevant to the times notion of masculinity really hard. And you have to imagine, even though in this point in time, in days past in history, children dying was far more commonplace in a first world society than it is today. So there was a little bit more numbness to the notion. It's still the crown prince of France, son of the king. And the king, as we have discussed throughout all of this, is not a bad guy. He's just not equipped to deal with it. He wants people to like him. He would have been a great placeholder king in history. And one of these guys, you go through Wikipedia like, oh, and King Louis XVI did nothing, and then who's next? But he just was it was just pushed into this period of history, the worst political upheaval really the modern Western world had ever seen. It wasn't ready for it. He just didn't have the skill set and the emotional base to handle it. And then his son dies. So yes, I believe firmly that his brother, at least, the Comte d'Artois, and probably the Queen, leveraged the fact that he was still super grieving about his son. It convinced him to fire Necker on the 11th of July. So remember, the Bastille falls on the 14th of July, and it's the 11th of July. I wonder if they're connected at all. So, Necker is having dinner. It's a Saturday. It's Saturday, July 14th, and the Saturday part's important because the plan was, we'll let him go on a Saturday. Sunday is an off day in Paris for almost every worker. They'll be out, drinking and carousing and doing things that are not reading the newspapers or listening to rumor. And by Monday, we'll have all the troops deployed and everything will be good to go. So Necker gets his dismissal letter at dinner on Saturday, June 11th, and he's instructed to tell no one. He's not only been fired, but he's been exiled. And it is a pink slip. He's handed a letter. It's like, here, you're gone. He literally opens it at the dinner table, reads it, excuses himself from the table without telling anyone, because he's been instructed to not tell anyone, and he packs up a few things and he's out of here. He's heading for Switzerland because he's been exiled and fired. Again, the idea was that Sunday was this day off for most people, and that the news of Necker's dismissal would not reach them until Monday. And by that time, the troops would be well positioned and they could rebuke any real dissent that happened. And the people didn't find out on Monday. They found out on Sunday. And they lost their minds. The entire week that's about to happen is a direct result of the fact that everyone underestimated what happens when you fire the people's hero. And it's not like the lesson surrounding this hadn't been taught to the crown last month. But they thought 20,000 troops in Paris was going to be enough to handle whatever uprising was going to happen. And and to a degree that figure is fair, because the last riots were in, the thousands, the four figures. So 5 figures of troops should be able to handle that. The problem is the uprising isn't going to be 4 figures of people. It's going to be tens of thousands of people that riot against the fact that Necker has been fired. So, that Sunday, Paris learns of Necker's firing. And this dismissal of Necker, apart from the fact that your hero has been taken from you, it's seen as the opening act. Remember, we talked about everyone felt like the hammer was coming, that the hammer was going to be dropped on Paris by this troop buildup. And so everyone sees Necker's firing as moving a piece off the board so that there was a clearer road to dropping that military hammer on the city. They also saw it as the opening blow toward a military action against the National Assembly by the Crown. So, at 7:40, we're going to get to point 2. Camille Desmoulins, who is in the bottom right of the photographs on this, or the pictures of people, is going to be a very important person for the future of the National and Legislative Assembly. He is going to be part of something called the triumvirate of individuals who basically controls the business of the National Assembly and the writing of the constitutions for a time, because there's going to be more than one constitution. But his first entry into the stage will be what he does at the Palais Royal. Now, the Palais Royal is this building here. And before we get into what happens there, we're going to go over who owns it. The Duc d'Orléans owns the Palais Royal. And we talked about how censorship laws didn't cover the activities of royal properties. And we all know the Duc d'Orléans doesn't really like his family that much. There's all these conspiracy theories about, was he really trying to get the crown for himself? His son would be king one day, but the Comte d'Artois would be king one day too. But what happens at the Palais Royal is the Duc d'Orléans basically opens it up for political free speech. He allows printers to set up printing presses in the Palais Royal so they can start printing newspapers. Remember when Brienne, when they finally said, we're going to have the Estates General, we want to hear from you, that was a signal to the people of Paris, start writing, start telling us. And newspapers started coming up out of nowhere. But they had already had a great jumpstart because the Palais Royal was this place where you could say whatever you wanted, you could print and write whatever you wanted. And Camille Desmoulins is going to stand up on a table in the Palais Royal once they learn about the fact that Necker is gone on that Sunday afternoon into the evening and give the speech of his life. And that speech is going to do a lot of things. I mean, it doesn't directly contribute to everyone doing what they do, but it certainly riles up a whole bunch of them. So hopefully your notes are in order. We'll come back after a break. We will get into what Camille Desmoulins says, what the after effect of that speech is, and then what happens over the next few days in Paris, up to and including the fall of the Bastille, and what happens right after that when we get back from a break. So stand up, stretch your legs. Thank you all very much for the subs on the way in. It helps give some more money to disabled American veterans. I appreciate it. CF Live and Max Music 93 did our BRB music. I'm going to stop saying that probably in a couple weeks, but still going to say thank you to them for it right now. We're going to go get a drink, stand up, and I'll be back in a few minutes. And we'll pick up with Camille Desmoulins at the Palais Royal.
Gentlemen, we're history.
Let's rock! We're back. Hopefully you guys were able to stand up and get your break in. Yeah, it was a quick 40 minutes, huh? It's one of the things I'm aiming for. I know that history can be dry in terms of the way it is presented. A lot of professors who I have listened to, I've sat in some classes just to sit in them because I enjoy the information. It can be a little dry. One of the ways that one of the things I'm trying to do here is present this in a way that is entertaining and interactive and answering your questions as they come up in chat. One of the things I was commended on, and someone who watches
Remember to
YouTube,
clonk that follow
how
button.
I'm able to ignore chat, and I don't want to ignore chat, but I will kind of let chat go through until I see a question. You guys are talking to me, I'm seeing your comments, but I'm not going to just react to everything I see just because it'll take me in the left field, and I'm trying to stay on the topic here. So let's talk about this gentleman, Camille Desmoulins. He is going to be huge for a couple of years. He's kind of one of those, like, Necker's a big deal, and you're really familiar with Jacques Necker now. Desmoulins will be one of those names. He's going to enter the scene today. And who he is he is the son of a magistrate. So he's one of those robed noble's sons who is going to inherit and become a magistrate via his father's position, right? He was sent. He's young. He's not. I think he's 20. He's in his mid-20s at this point in history. So he's super young, and he decided after he attended the Academy of Louis le Grand, which is the modern day lycée. He attended there, studied the law, and after he was there, he said, "I don't want to be a lawyer," and kind of broke from the path he was on to become this magistrate. This is still July 12th. Yes, this is July 12th. So when he decides he doesn't want to be a lawyer and therefore kind of rebukes the path he was on to replace his dad one day as a magistrate, he gets involved with writing political commentary. And what better time in history to become involved when writing political journalism than at this point, right? The press is becoming freer. One of the reasons he's probably hanging out at the Palais Royal, and he actually is not noted historically as a great orator. And remember, oratory is one of those two things, the two primary forms of entertainment, writing and oratory. And again, oratory is that thing that's supposed to be presented and with a tempo and articulation that's supposed to get your blood pumping. And he was not that guy. He didn't have that skill. He would partner with somebody who had that skill down the road, but he was a great writer. So it's ironic that he's the guy that stands up on a table on July 12th, 1789, at the Palais Royal and gives this amazing speech. We're not going to go into the details or the specifics of the speech. We'll go cover what he was really saying. He literally, in the evening, becomes the main attraction at the Palais Royal and goes into this very, just one of those speeches that gets the attention of people and gets their blood pumping. And he just broadsides everything about the crown. Just goes into everything that he believes that they are doing that's going to come down and just happen to the people of France. He says, this is it. The crown and the troops are coming for all of us. It's only a matter of time, and we can either submit to them or we can arm ourselves. And when he's saying this, when he's up on this table saying the troops are coming, the troops are literally coming. It's either coincidentally or he saw them and he decided to say it for the effect, but troops were visibly entering the area. And Desmoulins uses them as a prop effectively and says, the troops are coming because they're right there. We have to arm ourselves. With a pistol in his hand, he points it at his heart and says, I would rather die than to submit to servitude, which is the French version of Patrick Henry's give me liberty or give me death. I would rather die than to submit to servitude is the same sentiment. And he basically riles up everyone there. He convinces the crowd through this speech to march out of the Palais Royal. And they march out leaderless. There's no one at their head. He's not like with the torch at the front of them saying, "Follow me." But the energy of his speech convinces everyone there that, yeah, we have to go arm ourselves. So these crowds disperse from the Play Royale in the late afternoon, early evening, and they start going into the theaters around the area, shutting them down. You know, people were there to watch plays or whatever, and they were basically, the theater productions were shut down by the crowds, and the attendees to those productions were sucked up into the mob, and the mob grows coming out of the Play Royale, and it's not one mob, it's a bunch of independent mobs. And they start gathering in strength at the front of the Tuileries Palace. Now, the Tuileries Palace is the modern-day Louvre, and it's effectively this spot here in Paris. They start gathering there. And the mercenary cavalry, the German mercenary cavalry, rides in to try to break up what's going on, right? So this is the first time that these troops that have been brought in by, you know, the Queen and the Comte d'Artois, and with the under the rubber stamp of the King, it's the first time that they intervene on behalf of the crown against the mob. And they realize real quickly they're way outnumbered. And this is a theme that's going to continue to reoccur. These troops that were brought in are simply no match for the numbers that are in these crowds. So we'll go back to the Paris electors, right? They see what's going on. They see these crowds all over the place on the upper bank of the Seine, and they decide that they have to try to do something. So they get to the Tuileries Palace, and they try to get control of the crowd. And they do. They get control of the crowd's anger so that nothing really bad happens that night. But that isn't the end of things. So we move into Monday. This energized Paris, who have listened to what Camille Desmoulins has said. We need to arm ourselves. They walked away from that night without having done so, but still that seed is planted in their head. And what do? They start raiding swordsmiths and gun shops on the morning of Monday, the 12th of July. Sorry, the 13th of July. I see 12th in chat, and that's what I used. Monday, the 13th of July, the day before the Bastille falls. This crowd, these groups kind of reconvene in smaller pockets all over Paris, and they just start raiding everyday businessmen's gun stores and swordsmiths, and they just start taking weapons. And this is where in the opening credits...
No way!
Yes way! In the opening credits, I said the Paris mob has guns now. This is when they start getting guns. It won't be the end of it, but they're armed. Now the Paris mob, who has been energized by the notion that the crown and the troops are coming for them, saw it firsthand not only while Desmoulins was on the table, but at the Tuileries Palace. When the German cavalry came for them, they've now been convinced by all of these things that they must arm themselves, and they are doing so. And then the Abbaye Saint-Lazare, which is the first half of point number 3, is raided. The Abbaye Saint-Lazare on this map is... Or were they just convinced not to make a deal? I don't understand the question. So the Paris electors talked them down. What changed their minds overnight? Nothing changed their minds overnight. The crowd was still looking to arm themselves the next morning. So their intent was not changed. The Paris electors were able to convince the crowd basically to not burn down the Tuileries Palace that night. That was their contribution on the 12th. You have the Paris electors are this group of, again, upper bourgeoisie class individuals who are trying to harangue the sans-culottes, and that's not going to work out well. And pretty much it will kind of work out for about a year, and then it's not going to work much more beyond that. But they effectively were able to get to the people who did emerge as the mob leaders and say, hey, look, the Tuileries Palace is effectively the royal residence in the city. You cannot, storm it and expect nothing to happen to you. So we need to calm down. the only reason the German cavalry came is because you're here. And they said, okay. And then woke up the next morning going, no, 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 we still have to defend ourselves, because they woke up with the remembrance of what happened when de Moulin gave his speech and when the cavalry rode in and they began to arm themselves. And they do so again by raiding those swordsmith shops and raiding those gun shops, but they also raid the Abbaye Saint-Lazare, which sits somewhere, and I have to say somewhere because the building doesn't exist anymore, but it sits somewhere in here. So the Abbaye Saint-Lazare historically would become a prison. It would become a prison during the Terror. Yes, that is accurate. So they talked them out of violent action that night, but they weren't convinced not to continue down that path. That is a correct statement. So the Abbaye Saint-Lazare was just another, hospital place where the black sheep were sent. We'll get into that in a little bit. But it was a functional building of the church. And it was attacked on the 13th of July. And the sources that I have conflict on why. Some sources state it was because they were trying to do what they were trying to do that day, which is arm themselves, and the Abbaye Saint-Lazare being owned by the church. This is a date and time in history when the church certainly had its own army. We can talk about papal armies and defending the stairs of the papacy through the Holy Roman Empire's history, but one of the reasons was, were they going for guns? Were they going for food is the other one. But regardless of the reason why, what they find there is a pretty significant stockpile of grain. So there you have it on the 13th of July, in the middle of what is probably borderline a famine for the common people of France. You find this stockpile of grain, ready to be used, sitting in the Abbaye Saint-Lazare. And it fuels that notion that the aristocracy has been purposefully starving us. We go back to that idea of the famine pact, right? Where it wasn't true, but this made them all think it was true. So it energizes that anti-aristocratic energy. It energizes the energy. It energizes that mentality where, true or not, they found a mass stockpile of grain. Hey, it might have been mass stockpiled for the purposes of the Abbaye's use, but they found it, and it was being withheld from us, the common people, and so it must be being withheld from us so that we starve. Even though that there's only a causal relationship between those two facts. People are starving. There is a massive grain supply here, but was it placed here to starve the people? Probably not. But it doesn't matter. What the intent is irrelevant. It's what the perception is here that is absolutely relevant. Yeah, when everyone's starving, it's easy to look at any hoarding and be upset, legitimate or not. That is exactly what happened. So troops were called in, and again, they were overwhelmed by the size of the crowd at the Abbaye Saint-Lazare. And they had to withdraw from the city center entirely because the uprising at this point on the 13th was so big in terms of people that the troops that were pre-positioned there on Monday, as was intended for via Necker's firing, we were going to be in place and take care of whatever mob came, they were overwhelmed. They were so overwhelmed they couldn't even remain present in the city center. And we're talking about basically the city center being this entire area right here. They had to get out of this area of Paris. They were just overwhelmed. They withdrew. So the Paris electors are not fans of this wild mob running rampant. Remember, that's what they tried to shut down the night before. So the Paris electors see this as anarchy, and the only thing they can think to do is to organize it, right? Obviously we're not going to be able to convince them to stay home. We tried that last night, it didn't work. So what we are going to do now is organize this. And they organize the mobs into a citizens' militia. They're armed, so they start organizing them into, company regiment type ideas, except there's no uniforms, right? There's no time in the amount of time that they've had, basically the elapsing of several hours in the morning into the afternoon. There's been no time to produce a uniform for the new Citizens Guard of Paris. So what they do is they do this. They come up with what is called, I need to not do that one. I need to go back to my actual arrow so I can drag things along. they come up with this. So don't laugh at the name, but this is called a cockade. And the original cockade is blue and red. Fish! With the resub. Even though your name didn't fit. I gotta fix that. But go fish with the resub. Thank you very much. So this is called a cockade. And there's two examples of them here. You'll notice there's white here. But the original cockade that the electors tried to use was green. Because green was in French culture at that point the color of hope. But it was also the color of the royal arms of the Comte d'Artois, who was pretty much public enemy number one in the minds of the people at that point, given his rhetoric and some of the people understanding his positioning of troops and things like that. So they trashed the idea of the green cockade, and they go with blue and red, which are the colors of Paris. And they use blue and red that day. But the reason I have the blue, red, and white ones is very shortly, the Marquis de Lafayette is going to be named the commander of this National Guard. And he adds the color white to the cockade. And the white is the color of the Bourbons, the royal family of France. So red, white, and blue cockade, that's how you get to the flag of France today. It's exactly that direction. So you learned something else about the modern era. You learned how the French flag got its colors. It's directly related to the events of this day, and then the placement of white into the cockade by Lafayette in a couple of weeks. And this cockade will become a significant symbol to the sans-culotte. Like, disrespecting it will be a big deal. But that's how we got here. So another modern day fact derived from French history. Hey, look at that. The Bastille's down there. We'll get there. So, still on the day, July 13th, that Monday, this guard is organized to a degree. Troops have withdrawn from outside basically that blue perimeter, and the Abbaye Saint-Lazare, basically within that red square, is being, or has been, assaulted. So we'll get to the fall of the Bastille. The events around the Abbaye Saint-Lazare with arming people and getting that massive food store is important. But we're going to talk about what the Bastille was. So this whole self-policing effort that the electors of Paris have organized within the newly formed National Guard. And that's what I'm going to call it from now on, because that's what it's going to become. It's a citizens guard, a citizens militia. It doesn't have a lot of form, right? It's been around for exactly like 3/4 of one day at this point. But it will become the National Guard. So I'm going to refer to it as that from now on, just so that there's a continuity of terminology. The idea of policing oneself via the National Guard that the Paris electors had when they created it that day on the 13th of July didn't really do its job the next day. Mobs will storm Les Invalides, which is this building over here. So let's go ahead and erase all this first. Clear canvas. Oh, I didn't want to do that. That's everything. Ha ha ha! Thank God. That'd have been bad news for the rest of the stream. Hey, I can't get rid of it. That's awesome. Whoopsie, you're not wrong. Well, let's do it this way. There we go. Now I've got it going. Did they find weapons at the Abbaye? Yes. Just, it's the... Whoop, you for free, what's up? It's just not the... They stormed the Invalides the next day. So we're now into July 14th. Like it didn't... Remember I said it didn't last into the next day. So we're into the morning of July 14th, the day the Bastille falls now. Les Invalides is stormed first. So it's over here, Hôtel des Invalides. It really wasn't a hotel so much as it was an infirmary for veterans. Those who could not... Les Invalides is a terminology that actually means someone who cannot do something. And it was a veterans hospital. Mobs storm it in the morning. It's the modern-day Musée de l'Armée in Paris, by the way. So if you've ever been to Paris and been to the Army of the Museum of France, that's the place. And I actually want to go there because they have a lot of artifacts from this era and forward, and it's on my list of places to actually visit. But July 14th, morning. The Les Invalides is stormed by more mobs of Paris. You can kind of feel at this point that no matter what's happening, no matter what the Paris electors are trying to really accomplish, that they're not getting control of things the way they want, because armed mobs are now rising up the next day and storming another. It's a hospital, but it's a military building. They storm it. They obtain 30,000 muskets when they storm it, and they also obtain heavy guns. And when I mean heavy guns, I mean cannons. They get their hands on actual large cannon that have to be moved around by horses. But the problem is they don't have any powder for the guns. They have some, but not enough. Yeah, oh, you're not wrong, Rocket. They get their hands on 30,000 muskets, and they get their hands on heavy guns, and they don't have the powder to load the heavy guns. And the reason they don't have the powder is because the commanding officer of Les Invalides saw the crowd coming, basically. He saw what was going to happen. They have 30,000 clubs, some of which are capable of shooting, because remember, they stormed gunsmiths and the Abbaye Saint-Lazare the day before. They have some powder, right? But the amount of powder necessary to fire, a heavy 12-pound gun, no. They don't have that. They don't have enough of it for it to be meaningful yet. And I mean yet. So they storm Les Invalides. They get the 30,000 muskets. There is no powder there. And the reason there is no powder there is because the commanding officer of Les Invalides saw the crowd coming and knew that its storming was a matter of time. And he moved the powder from Les Invalides to where do you think the powder went? Any guesses in chat where the powder from Les Invalides the morning of the 14th of July ends up? The Bastille. You're correct. So the whole notion that the Bastille was stormed to free the prisoners there is nonsense. They didn't storm the Bastille. They didn't form up around the Bastille because they wanted to free prisoners. They formed up around the Bastille because that's where the powder for the guns went. The commanding officer of Les Invalides lets them know this information freely, and they're on their way to the Bastille later on in that morning. But we're going to talk about what the Bastille is, because now the stage is set for why the Paris mobs are heading to the Bastille on the 14th of July, right? Idiot should have kept his mouth shut. Yeah, but remember, Rocket, it's not just the commander. There are troops at Les Invalides who probably are sympathetic to the crowds, just as they have been for about a month by not, following orders. And somebody probably is going to tell them anyway. And it's one of those things where it's like, get them out of here so the problem goes elsewhere. Because we are not equipped. We're overwhelmed by the numbers. We're not equipped to deal with this many rioters. And remember, at this point, all of the troops have withdrawn from the city center. All those additional 20,000 troops are not in Paris anymore. They're outside the city center. So these guys are basically on their own. And they're like, it went that way. So let's dispense with the idea that the reason we go from Les Invalides to the Bastille is to free prisoners. They're going from Les Invalides to the Bastille to get the powder to fire the cannons. They have some powder, right? There's enough to fire the cannons a few times. There's enough to probably arm most of those muskets once or twice. But what is the Bastille? So you'll see your first picture of the Bastille here. This 4 on the north side, 4 on the south side, which were the long side towers surrounding, and actually that picture is backwards. It should be flipped, but it doesn't matter because there's a better diagram below. Don't want the eraser. I want this. Welcome to the Bastille. This is what the Bastille looked like from the outside. These are drawings. It doesn't exist really in the same vein anymore. It's called Place de la Bastille today. But the crowd begins to form up in this red box I've already outlined, this U-shaped box. Or this U-shaped box. Time to free Arno. Yeah? So the Bastille was a medieval fortress. It was built on the east side of Paris as a defensive point, right? So if you go back up above to this, you'll see that it's a stick-out point on what used to be the eastern edge of the walled city of Paris. So if you're approaching anywhere in that north or southern field, you're under fire from the Bastille. It's mostly cafes today. Not been there. It was designed to defend that east side of the city. There are these 4 stone towers on each side. They are about 5 to 7 stories tall at this point in history, and prisoners are held within the towers in octagonal cells. And that aspect of Assassin's Creed is accurate. They actually got the cell shape correct. That's one of the things, the first thing I noticed when I was playing that game. I was like, hey, look, these cells are right. It earns its tyrannical reputation. So we're going to go back to Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu and the use of lettres de cachet, which are those letters that have the full effect of law, are seen as tyrannical. They're used with great effect to put basically anybody they want into the Bastille and other prisons, and it starts to accumulate this reputation as this symbol of tyranny, because that's where the unjustly imprisoned go during the reign of Louis XIII. It is a place where political dissidents are sent, violators of censorship laws at that time are sent, and it's just, again, rampant use of the lettre de cachet. No trial, no jury, just pick you up, you're ordered to go to jail. That's the way the justice system worked under Cardinal Richelieu. And so you kind of see that's where the tyrannical notion of him and that era in French history comes from. But remember, again, they were solidifying in that point in time what the Ancien regime was. You know, Louis XIV would inherit it, but the foundational elements of now this regime that's dead, it died last month when the National Assembly was formed, the foundations of it were born under those two. They solidified.
Remember to clonk that follow button.
So the other thing that could land you in the Bastille is if you were a black sheep of your family, like, and there's no other way to put this, sadists, perverts, the embarrassing person in your family whom you didn't want to be at your house when the fancy guests came over, you could go to the crown, purchase a lettre de cachet to put your own family member into the Bastille. And one of the most famous members of the Bastille's roster of prisoners, the Marquis de Sade, was placed there via that very mechanism. There will be 2 other people I believe it's 2. There will be 2 other people in the Bastille via that mechanism the day it is stormed. It is messed up. The conditions that a prisoner experienced varied greatly on who you were. So, again, if you were placed there as one of these black sheep, these lettres de cachet bought by your family to put you in jail because you couldn't behave yourself, you generally had the floor to yourself. You were able to bring in your own furniture. You were able to, you had to live in the cell, but you could get what you wanted. The guards were amenable to the notion that your family is rich and you have money and you want this book or you want this food, we'll go get that for you. So if you were in there and you were one of these black sheeps, you didn't have it really badly. But if you were one of the poor people, you were given meager meals, not starved to death, and you were treated poorly, but it wasn't a nightmare situation. The people outside thought it was, but you were not tortured, you were not fed badly, you were given enough to live, you were a prisoner, right? And you were treated as such, but you weren't starved, you weren't tortured, you weren't hung from the walls. And even though it wasn't that bad at this point in history, 1789, the reputation that the Bastille had had for, 200 years was there. And it got worse during the 18th century because as censorship laws and loopholes around censorship began to kind of bubble up, those who had been in the Bastille started to write as if it was a nightmare in there. And they described things like skeletons being chained to the walls, and there was no light at all inside, and disease was rampant, and there were rats everywhere. And it adds to this notion that this place is evil. It's a symbol of tyranny, and the people in there are tortured and treated poorly. So in the minds of the sans-culottes who are currently marching from Les Invalides to the Bastille, it does have that connotation that it's this place that is terrible. And a prison is terrible. And there's no way around. Every prison is terrible. But it wasn't as bad in the Bastille as it was made out to be at the time. It seems that the Bastille's reputation and the commoners rising up against it is probably why it is viewed as a kickoff to the revolution. I can see that. Like, this is the thing, right? This is the day celebrated, like French Independence Day is this Bastille Day, the July 14th. But to me, it seems backwards because in America, we celebrate, July 4th, 1776, because that's the day that the Declaration of Independence was signed. That is the date of affirmative no turning back, right? You cannot take that away and undo the Declaration of Independence. You have to now be beaten into submission by the British or win, right? That is the day. So this is just a part of a series of days in French history. We've talked about, the Abbé Saint-Lazare and the Les Invalides, and we've talked about the National Assembly coming to fruition in June. Those are all things you can't take back either. And there's no piece of paper being written down by anybody that says we're now free and the monarchy's dead. That's going to happen next month. But the notion that this is the day, right? It always strikes me as odd because what's so special about this violent assault in this period of 3 days in France, as opposed to Les Invalides or the Abbé Saint-Lazare or the marching on the Tuileries Palace after Camille Desmoulins gives his speech. Those are all equally important to me. So I think if you're going to say, where's the Declaration Day for the sans-culottes in Paris, I think it's that Sunday when Desmoulins gets them going. That's the key in the ignition in my mind. Oh, but every time you say sans-culottes, I just keep imagining a bunch of people walking around pantsless. Yeah, it means socksless. It's the right term, and if you go read a book and they say sans-culottes, now you'll know what it means. It's breechless. It's fancy silk knee breeches. I know it means pants, but it was a part. So the pants and the socks. I don't want to pull my.
Yes, I'm excited about this.
Pull my leg up here, but the culotte was the silk piece of the breeches that tied to the shortened pant. And I don't know how else to describe it, but that's the term that at the time contemporarily and historically is used to describe the distinction between the poor and the wealthy. I'm sorry I keep putting pantsless into your head. Historically, I know what it means, and I understand from I've learned French in school, or I know French, that you hear sans culotte and you hear no pants, because that is technically what it means. But in context of the term with respect to the time, it means socksless. We're gonna cut a head off today, just not with a guillotine, by the way. All right. Anyway, so it housed fewer and fewer prisoners. The Bastille housed fewer and fewer prisoners as we roll through the 18th century, and the upkeep on it becomes really hard to justify because we're talking about rolling through the financial crisis, right? This is a fortress that requires a garrison of troops. It requires food. It requires water to be brought in from the outside. So it's expensive to maintain, plus the maintenance of the actual physical structure. And so it becomes really hard to justify paying for that upkeep and housing prisoners there during effectively the mid-18th century to where we are now. So fewer and fewer prisoners are housed there. But remember, this thing didn't even start off as a prison. It started off as a fortress, a bastion point for the defense of the city. So the city grows past it, and so it's just a fort in the middle of the city that gets used as a prison. So on the eve of the revolution, it was this symbol of tyranny. It was representative of the ancien regime. And if you look at how it demanded the area around it, it was visibly this larger than the rest of things around me structure. So it stood there, and every time people looked at it, it was just this symbol of the Ancien regime. It was a symbol of the failure of the Ancien regime. It was a symbol of the tyranny of that regime. And so on that day, it just so happens that that's the place the powder is, and it adds to the energy of things. But remember, they're not going there for the prisoners. They'll eventually use the prisoners as puppets, but they're going there for the powder. I think it was more of a, oh goody, it's the Bastille, let's go tear it down because that's where what we need is, and it's the Bastille, right? So, the fortress falls. Throughout the morning, on July 14th, the commander, who we're going to roll back up here and name for you, Bernard Jourdan de Launay. This gentleman right here is in command of the Bastille on the day it falls. He sees the same thing that the commander at Les Invalides saw, that there are mobs out there and they're growing and they're getting bigger. And he watched the crowd outside the walls, realistically in this U area on the map, grow into the thousands and then tens of thousands. Launay took the powder from Les Invalides simply because he was in a better position tactically to house it, right? Les Invalides is a ground structure. It doesn't have a drawbridge. It's not this massive 7-story towered defendable place, right? Les Invalides is technically a hospital. The Bastille is a fortress. So he accepts the powder from Les Invalides because basically it's the better place to try to keep it away from the people. When the powder gets transferred to the Bastille, the only reinforcement that Delaunay gets is 32 Swiss mercenary guard. So you'll add that to the veterans that he had on site, and these are invalid veterans. These are veterans that are really not suited for the frontier. They're there, they can function as guards, prison guards, but they're not top tier, crack squad soldiers. So there he is with 32 Swiss guard and his complement of invalid regulars, and he has 144 troops. 144 troops inside the Bastille against tens of thousands of people standing across the drawbridge, basically. The Bastille only held enough food inside at that point in time for 2 days. So that makes the siege really problematic, because if that crowd decides to not go home, they can only hold out for 2 days. And the bigger problem is, and this is every siege in history can be won this way, that didn't have its own internal water supply. Water had to be brought in. So anytime you anytime you can cut the water supply off to a city you've surrounded or a fortification you've surrounded, you're likely going to win that siege, because disease becomes rampant when you can't wash anything, let alone drink. They still seem to think they're going to play keep away to keep the powder for the military. That's the game plan. I think it was realistically, when the powder was transferred, there were not tens of thousands of people outside. But by the time it was inside, there was tens of thousands of people outside. The people that were coming from Les Invalides and everybody they could grab across town on their way there, that's who ended up at the Bastille. So as this crowd is now mulling around outside the drawbridge area of the Bastille here, the Paris electors get back involved, right? And you have to remember, the crowd that's out there is also now largely comprised of the National Guard, the citizen militia. They're wearing the duo-colored cockade on their hats and on their jackets to identify themselves. And that's what that was for, by the way. The cockade was to identify, I'm a member of the Guard and so are you, in the absence of a uniform. As an easily readily identifiable visually, that guy's on my side. So the Paris electors roll in and say, whoa, what's going on down here? And after this crowd had been basically pressed up against the walls of the Bastille for most of the day, they get two representatives, two of the electors, get through the crowd, get to the drawbridge, and get admitted, because they're there to negotiate. But the problem is, they were admitted into the Bastille, and then they were gone for a long time. too long in the minds of the crowd. The crowd started to believe that they had just been simply captured. They had been disappeared. That they weren't coming back out. They were just being held. So the Paris electors, after a period of time, send a third representative in. And he is sent in with specific orders to demand the powder, because the Paris electors aren't trying to keep the guns and the powder from being in the hand of the sans-culottes. They're just trying to resolve the situation in favor of themselves and the citizens. So the first demand is turn over the powder. Turn over all of the weapons inside the Bastille. And those heavy guns that are all around the ramparts, take them down and give them to us too. Those are the reasonable demands of the Paris electors at the Bastille. Delaunay says, I can't hand the powder over without some sort of order from Versailles or from my superiors. I can't hand it over. I'm not going to hand it over. But he says, look, before you even got here, I was already taking the guns down. I'm not going to give you the guns from the walls, but they're being moved out of a threatening position. We're not trying to threaten the crowd with them. So tactically, I think it was a dumb move because you've taken away the visible defenses of the Bastille. Hey, the big guns on the walls are gone, so we can get closer and threaten the structure more. Because right now, the only way to get in is that drawbridge. This drawbridge that is sitting right here. This guy. So there they are. The representative is inside, demanding guns and powder, and Delaunay is saying, there's no way I'm giving them to you, but I'll get them out of the threatening strategic position they are in because I want to calm the crowd down. I think he misread it tactically. The crowd didn't care that the guns were on the towers. The crowd cared that the power they needed to fuel the guns they already had was inside. So, nothing else, and I'm sorry, I got my time wrong. This all happens before noon. So, from the to the Bastille, and the Paris electors sending in their representatives, and the third representative going in is all before noon. Hey, that shouldn't be there. I have that turned off. I'll have to turn that off again. Little things I have to still switch over. So before noon, nothing else happens, right? The third representative gets the answer is no, comes back out with the other two representatives, and what happens is those three representatives say, hey, we don't know what else to do. We're going to go back to the Hotel de Ville, which is right up the road, by the way. It's not that far, and I did it again. Hotel de Ville is not that far from where the Bastille is. It's a couple blocks up the street. Right there to right there. So they go back to the Hotel de Ville. And everything is, cool and calm, and it's pretty much as soon as the Paris electors leave, all hell breaks loose. We're going to cover that hell breaking loose in its fullest when we come back from a break. I've been going for another 40 minutes, believe it or not. So stand up, walk around. I'm going to rest my voice, get a drink, use a restroom, and we're going to find out what happened at the Bastille around noon, right after the Paris elector representative left the scene, and pretty much the crowd was left to its own devices, knowing that the answer from Delaunay was no. Be right back in a few. Hope you'll be here when I get back. Thanks for hanging out, everybody. Hope you're having fun tonight.
Gentlemen, we're history.
Duke is on deck.
Dodson! We've got Dodson here! Nobody cares.
Shame! 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 Shame!
Let's rock!
Sturf, that's me too. I've always wanted to go to France. I've never wanted to go to Paris, right? There was a period in my life where I was just like, I don't want to go to Paris. It's touristy and blah, blah, blah. Now I want to go to Paris. You know, after spending several years studying the French Revolution for the purposes of kicking off this series, I definitely want to go to Paris because I want to see these places. I want to go and explore where these people march down these streets. And even though the Tuileries Palace isn't there anymore because it's the Louvre now, it's still the location. And I'm very interested to see what I can see and learn what I can learn. I definitely will go to the Musée de l'Armée because not only is it relevant to this, but it's relevant to World War I and World War II as well. So it has definitely taken me from wanting to go to just Flanders and the frontier areas of the trenches are of World War I and the Maginot Line, and just draw me back into Paris to where I want to actually go see Paris. But before we let the sans-culottes do what they're going to do to the Bastille, believe it or not, we have a song that is relevant to this day in French history. So, as we are trying to do, we are incorporating the relevant music that talks about history into the series. Some caveats about this song. One, I'm not the biggest fan of the band, but lots and lots of people are, and I have my own personal reasons for not loving them because I was taught, how to play drums by a person who loved them, and I heard them all the time growing up. Second is the song is not historically accurate, and I have noted in the lyrics where it's not accurate. There it is, number 98. He's got it. It is Rush. Bastille Day by Rush. Here we go. Told you I annotated it. Yes, I did, Gilly. I sufficiently pushed up my nerd glasses and I wrote them. That's true. That's also true. Wasn't ready either. It's also true.
Remember to clonk that follow button.
He's up there, Rocket. Welcome back. So, before we go to the Bastille, let's talk the storming of the Bastille, the actual storming of it. Let's talk about a couple things in that song real quick. It's a good song. Rush has that 70s feel that I love in a lot of music. It's that, that Led Zeppelin vibe I love so much. Just for some reason, I heard them too much is why I'm kind of burnt on Rush. Neil Peart, fantastic drummer. There's no doubting it. YYZ is an incredibly difficult song to play. And the song's relevant, so it's why it made it in tonight, because we don't have a lot of French Revolution music that is relevant. The next time we might have a song is 1804, to be quite honest. Never connected with that song before. So the things that are said in there, let them eat cake. We've already talked about that. Marie Antoinette did not say it. It's actually because of a much older Austrian who wrote it in a journal or book, and it was later on just tied to Marie Antoinette because of her aloofness and her lack of care for the common people. Those things are true. The guillotine is not invented yet. Well, it's theorized, but it's not built. It's actually the machine is what it's called. Guillotine is just the name of the person who proposes it. Excuse me. So no one's getting beheaded by a guillotine today. And then the notion that the king kneels, no. We're going to get into the ramifications for the king at the end of this tonight, at least the initial things. But the king doesn't supplicate himself in any way because of the events of the Bastille. It just isn't that simple. An example of something she might say rather than something she did say. That's true. A lot of quotations in history get attributed to people because it sounds like something they may have said even though they didn't. It's just one of those historical urban legends that I really hate. And it just, I like facts, and when I learned, I was like, man, I've been told that this is what she said my whole life, and it's not true. If you want to see someone else who has an equally passionate hate for that quotation, follow Fake History Hunter on Twitter, because every time someone says it, he tracks them down, or she tracks them down and corrects them. All right, but that is Fall of the Bastille, or Bastille Day, I'm sorry, by Rush. Mid-70s release. It's a good song, for a Rush song, for sure. But it's a good song, and again, relevant to what we're talking about. So, as we talked about before the break, yeah, use the force, Luke, Abraham Lincoln. The Paris electors, around noonish, decide they're going to go back to the Hotel de Ville and say, hey, what's going on? We don't have any more ideas, and Delaunay won't give in the face of tens of thousands of people outside his walls. So, while they were gone, a subgroup from the group of people outside the Bastille's gates scale the walls. They get inside, and they cut the ropes that are holding up the drawbridge, and they go, honk. So all of these people that are outside decide to rush into the inner courtyard of the Bastille. So they go like this. Right? Once they are inside, the soldiers who are there are shocked, right, that these people are rushing inside. And what do you think soldiers, all 144 of them, who now have seen their main gate compromised, do? What do you think those soldiers are going to do to those people running into that S-box, that main interior courtyard? Exactly, Rocket. They open fire. So this is a problem because these people are unaware that their own people cut the ropes. They thought that Delaunay had ordered the drawbridge down. So when they rush in and a couple hundred are killed or injured by the shooting soldiers, what's that smell like? An ambush. It smells like they invited the Paris mob into the interior courtyard of the Bastille so that they were in a box. So they could be shot on from all sides, and that realistically, I mean, if you're talking about it, that's a great ambush setup. If you can get a crowd of people inside here, and there's a press behind them so they can't get out, and you can just shoot down into that, that's a great ambush. It makes sense as to why the people who were being shot at thought that they had been set up, even though it was their own people who let them in. So that sets the mindset further down into the bad spectrum of, we had to come here to get the powder, and now they lured us into an ambush. And they definitely got gunpowder for days at a choke point. Also true. Around 100 Parisians were killed or wounded. This raised the temperature of the mob even higher because they felt like they were being ambushed. And over the next few hours, they're still pressed inside the S-box. The order to cease fire has been given, but they cannot penetrate the walls, nor can they penetrate the inner courtyard. So they're all now mulling around inside here, along with being crowd pressed into this area by everybody behind them. So they're not leaving. They can't get out. So there's a mass of people here trickling all the way back down around the bend. But over those intervening hours, they start to get bolstered by members of the Guard, organized members of the National Guard, the City Guard, and members of the regular army who are defecting over because they sympathize with the crowd more than they do with the crown. The needs of the crowd are very much more parallel to the common soldier than they are with the aristocrat or even the bourgeoisie. And that'll be relevant later. But what this does is it adds an element of organization to the crowd, right? It's an undisciplined mob at that point, but these soldiers, both guardmen and fully in uniform French infantry, are walking in and they're starting to organize the mob. They bring down the heavy guns that were seized from Les Invalides. So those big guns that they have a couple of shots for, they weren't here on the scene because they didn't have a means to really transport them. It's a roving mob of pedestrians. But the Guard and the army defectors get the guns down to the Bastille, and then they point them at the inner door. So now you've got cannons pointing at the inner door, right here. And they are loaded. They don't have a whole lot of rounds, but they're loaded. What happens at that point is Delaunay sticks a white handkerchief through that door and says, parlez? Basically, he wants to talk. And this is about 5 p.m. at this point, where Delaunay has put up not a surrender handkerchief, but we'd like to, have a under the banner of truce conversation. His conditions are that he and all of his men walk out free. He'll leave the powder, he'll leave the fortress in the hands of everybody there, but he and his men must walk free. And the organized member of the Guard and the defectors of the army are amenable to this. However, they weren't there when the initial ambush happened, and the crowd wants Delaunay because they see him as the instigator of an ambush. No one's going to convince this mob that Delaunay didn't trap and kill and hurt 100 of them. They even if the people who cut the ropes are going to say, no, we did that. That wasn't him. No, the energy's too high at this point. They see Delaunay as the villain at this point. They want him. So Delaunay says that if he cannot walk free with his men, he will do the following. With everybody still packed into the Bastille, he'll light the Les Invalides powder, blow the fortress, and kill everyone inside. The crowd refuses the deal. The guns are pushed back up to the door. And when the guns are repointed back up to the door after everyone's come back out of this conference, the doors drop open. Because they called his bluff, basically. That Delaunay was bluffing. He wasn't going to blow the fort, but he had to try to play that card to get his men out of there. So the crowd rushes into the inner fortress. They rush into this section and all the surrounding apartments, and they get access basically to the whole fortress at that point. They do not find the hordes of prisoners that everybody said were going to be in the Bastille. Remember the whole mythos of it being this place of terrible tyranny, that all these people were being chained to the walls and their skeletons. They find seven people held in the Bastille. 7. As I noted during the song by Rush, there were 7 people in the Bastille being held prisoner. The breakdown is this. 4 of them were forgers, meaning they had tried to forge documents or currency. 2 of them were lunatics in the parlance of the time, which in modern sensibilities would mean they were mentally off. There was a mental difference in them, so they were, in this era of history, they were loony, and they were being held in the Bastille, almost as if the Bastille was also an insane asylum. 1 of them was a deviant aristocrat, not the Marquis de Sade. It's popular to say there was a deviant aristocrat in the Bastille on the day it was stormed, and it was the Marquis de Sade. No, it was not the Marquis de Sade. The Marquis de Sade was moved out the week earlier because he had been sitting in one of those tower windows in his cell yelling down to the crowds, "They're going to kill us all. There's going to be a massacre in here. The hundreds of prisoners that are being held here are going to get killed by the guards." He was riling up everybody outside, so they transferred him out of there so he couldn't have that effect in the crowd anymore. Well, literally a week before it was stormed, but he was not there. But regardless of there being only 7, those 7 prisoners are really not all that excited about being a part of what is going on. They're like, yeah, this is nuts. You know, we're prisoners in the Bastille, but what you're doing is crazy. And regardless, they are hoisted up as trophies and paraded around the city. Like, look, we freed the prisoners of the Bastille, all 7 of them. So they become political puppets for a day. Like, here they are, the prisoners of the Bastille. We can seat them at a table over here at this side of the cafe because there really aren't that many of them. The point being in all of this is that we talked about earlier, what's the motivation of the crowd going from Les Invalides to the Bastille? It's the powder, right? And they certainly use the notion, the crowd and the sans-culottes and the Paris electors use the notion of the freed prisoners of the Bastille to great political effect. But the reality of it is they did not march 100 people out of the Bastille that day. They marched 7 people out of the Bastille that day. And realistically, none of them were all too happy about being now a part of what was going on. They would have probably felt better staying there. So, the mob, now that the prisoners are freed, Delaunay hasn't gone anywhere because they won't let him, nor have the other soldiers. They turn their attention to Delaunay and the other soldiers. Delaunay is quickly scooped up. He is marched back to, and I did it again, and I need to get better about that, he is marched back to the Hotel de Ville, because at that point, the guard and the regular defectors are of the mindset that the Paris electors should probably figure out what to do with him. But on the way there, he's beaten up pretty badly. I mean, this is a lynch mob at this point that is transporting Bernard Jourdan Delaunay back to the Hotel de Ville for a non-jury trial where he'll be sentenced by a shadow government entity to his fate. And while they're all kind of caroused around the Hotel de Ville, they're debating. The crowd is debating what should happen to him, like a lynch mob would do. Well, they should shoot him. They should cut his head off. He should be in prison, blah, blah. And Delaunay basically has enough. He says, enough. Let me die. And he actually kicks one of the men in the crowd.
No way!
Yes way! He actually kicks one of the men in the crowd. And what happens really quickly is after he kicks that guy, it's all over. He's stabbed like 9 times. And then once he's on the ground bleeding out, like 20 people pull out pistols and shoot him just to make sure he's dead. And then here it comes. His head comes off. But not via the guillotine. Someone cuts off Delaunay's head with a pocket knife. And it becomes a hold-up trophy that is paraded around the city. And there is the first personage of historical significance killed during the French Revolution series. 3 other Bastille officers, 2 other regulars from the Bastille garrison are also lynched by the crowd. So grand total, 3 + 2 + 1, 6 military members are killed by the mob in Paris that day. And Bernard Jourdan Delaunay has the dubious distinction of being this guy. The first guy on the dead side during the French Revolution series. Welcome to the board. You stay there until we're done. He's dead. I don't think it's a matter of mess up. I think it's a matter of the temperature. I mean, this is a group that felt they were ambushed in the Bastille. They've been riled up for days by Desmoulins and everything else that's going on. I think it's just a matter of he kicked one of the crowd members. He told them to kill him, and at that point, he's dead, and everyone have a look. Here's the proof of the death of the tyrant who killed/injured 100 people at the Bastille. He ambushed us. What an evil man. I think it really is that simple. He will not be the last person to lose his head. Not by a mile. You're talking 5 figures of people are going to lose their head. But he is the first notable historical casualty during the series, and he will not be the last. So, that is the storming of the Bastille. That is how it went down. That was the motivation behind it and actually what happened. All one day. Hopefully I've lended some clarity to it. Now we're going to talk about what happened after that, very briefly. So as I said, again, in my annotations on Bastille Day by Rush, is that the king didn't kneel that day. He didn't find out. Versailles doesn't find out, because this is already into the evening, right? The 5 p.m., guns to the wall, handkerchief comes out, and it takes them time to get back up to the Hotel de Ville. So Delaunay is not dead until the evening, 9 o'clock at night. So Versailles doesn't find out about what has happened, both at Les Invalides and down at the Bastille, until the next day. And the question that gets asked is, okay, all the troops had been withdrawn from the city center, right? Well, why, when there was a mob in a pretty, you could have bottlenecked them there, right? You could have gone up behind that crowd, bottlenecked them in between the main entrance to that upper portion of that bend to get to the drawbridge. You could have boxed that crowd in had you sent the 20,000 troops you had to do so. Why was the Bastille not reinforced is the big question. Why did the troops not show up in force? And it's because at that point, given there were defections coming out of the army and the performance of the guard units, the crown really no longer trusted the army. We're going to get into why morale in the army was so bad next week, but it plays into this point right now. Because the crown could not trust the army, when Louis and the court finds out the next day that the Bastille has fallen, and the question in court is, what are we going to do? When you can't trust your own army, what can you do? And this is the moment, not the 14th, but the 15th, when the monarchy doesn't fall, but the notion of absolute monarchy dies in France. The idea that the king is all-powerful, can enforce his will anywhere, that's done. Because if you cannot put your own troops into your own, capital city and enforce the rule of law, how much authority do you have? And that harsh reality slaps real quick back in Versailles. Like, what can we do? It slaps so quickly that the Comte d'Artois is out of here. Like, literally within days. The Comte d'Artois leaves France, realizing he can do nothing else to save the old, status quo. He will begin to host his court basically on the go, moving from country to country, all around France. Not France, all around every other country but France. Austria, Prussia, all the little duchies and principates around the edges and fringe, the border of Holy Roman Empire. And his entire aim the whole time he is an immigrant is, how do I undermine what's going on in France? But he's gone. He tries to convince the queen to leave too and take the royal family with them, but Marie Antoinette says no. Where would they realistically go? And the only place they could have realistically gone was to go to Austria, where her brother was Holy Roman Emperor. But that would have done nothing except fuel the notion that, hey, there goes the king and the queen to Austria to raise an army to come back and crush what's going on here. And she kind of resigned herself to the fate of what's going to happen in France at that point. I really feel like maybe the whiplash of the summer and now this and the death of her son finally all caught up to her. But she said, no, this is where Louis will never leave, and this is where my husband is, my family is, we're staying. So the royal family does not leave. So what's going to happen next week? Louis will concede that he is no longer the absolute monarch, but a citizen king. That he is a partner in leadership, almost like the executive branch of government. So we transitioned from the notion of the absolute monarchy to the constitutional monarchy, which is what the National Assembly is, taking an oath to build. We will talk about this irrational fear that begins to sweep across the French countryside and what its causes are and what problems it causes within the French people. Yeah, we're way past the point of no return now. And then the National Assembly will have just a heck of a night in August where they tear down the feudal system in one glorious night. And they will do one other thing. They remember when we talked about the First Estate and the priests and how the one thing they wanted when they joined the National Assembly was keep the tithe intact. On that same glorious night in August, the tithe will go bye-bye and cause some problems inside the National Assembly. But that will be next week. Hopefully you've enjoyed episode 1.5. We will get into a much speedier timeline because, as we've talked about, the French Revolution is not a hurricane. It is a series of explosions and tornadoes that hit. We are going to begin to emerge from this first one next week, and then the timeline will speed up. We might actually make it into 1780 or 1790 next week. We'll see what happens with respect to the notes, but Jacques Necker will become less and less of a big deal. The Marquis de Lafayette will be named the head of the National Guard. Paris will get a mayor, among other things, and we will certainly see a Paris mob march on Versailles to claim their citizen king and tell him he has to live in Paris, which is going to change all kinds of things. And let the games begin indeed, Sturf, because that change to Paris for the royal family and in turn the National Assembly will be a big deal. So I'm glad you're all here. Let's get to the quiz, yeah? Let's go talk about quiz points. Let me get the questions up on the side of the screen here. Here we go. Okie dokie. You can see the leaderboard all time for the series. Rocket's way out in front. There are 10 questions tonight. And here is question number 1. How many troops had been moved into Paris by the eve of the storming of the Bastille? How many troops had been moved into Paris by the eve of the storming of the Bastille? There it is. Number 98 gets it. Not how many Swiss Guard had been moved, but how many troops have been moved into the city. Not how many Swiss Guards have been moved to the Bastille. Number 98 gets it. He's on it. Number 98 moves up to number 3 in a 3-way tie with Mads and Doc. Actually, only 9 questions, so I forgot to cover that. So here goes question number 2. Apart from France, where did the troops that bolstered the Paris garrisons come from in terms of their nationality? Swiss, German. Rocket gets it. Rocket moves up to 18, 10 ahead of Sturf. Question number 3. What building now Paris City Hall do the Paris electors work out of? Hotel de Ville is correct. Rocket on top of it. Rocket goes up 11. The next question. Who was the only person in early July 1789 with an A power who was pushing for subsidized bread and grain? Necker, Rocket again. We're going to have to come up with a second prize, I think.
Remember to clonk that follow
Competition
button.
going here. The next question. What was found in sizable quantities during the raid on Les Invalides? Not grain, not grain, not grain, not grain. Les Invalides happened the morning of the 14th. Guns. Guns is the right answer, and Rocket was first. $30,000 muskets is a very accurate answer, along with several heavy guns. Rocket opening up her lead. The next question. I will not accept a simple answer for this. Title and the name, please. Who owned the Palais Royal where Camille Desmoulins gave his famous speech? Duke d'Orléans. Gilly gets one. The next question. We got 3 left tonight. This will not be a one-word answer. I require the context of the answer here, please. Do not fire off one word. I will not accept it as the answer. What was the true driving motivation of the crowd for marching on the Bastille? They needed gunpowder for their guns. Yes, the gunpowder for their guns that they seized at Les Invalides. Gilly gets it. It was actually the Les Invalides powder. And the commander of the Les Invalides sent it there. There's Gilly. Now in number 3 in a 4-way tie for 3rd place. Second to last question tonight. Thank you all for hanging out, participating. Who was the defending commander? Last name is fine of the Bastille, and how many troops did he have? And how many troops did he have? In one line, please. The answer together in one line. Who was the defending commander of the Bastille, and how many troops did he have? 144 and Larnay. Someone gets his name right. Not de Larnay. This is going to be a tough one to sift through because no one's getting it right. Right now, Rocket's got the most correct answer. It's de Launay. Launay. Not de Larnay. Still got an R in there. We'll go give it to Rocket. Everyone thinks it's Larnay when it's Launay. Rocket got the closest first. It's good to see people paying attention, though. Rocket at 22. Bernard Jourdan de Launay with 144 troops and a dream, as it said in the opening credits. Not saying I drop hints as to what the questions might be in the opening credits, but there was one of them. The last question for tonight. Oh my God, spell check, stop. Don't use your phone. The last question of the night. How did Delaunay die? Use the method and tools used, please. How did he die? Killed by the crowd using knives and guns. The pocket knife was the beheading. Stabbed 9 times, shot 20 times, beheaded by a pocket knife. Diggity, shot, beaten, and decapitated with a pocket knife. Let's see. Killed by crowd using knives and guns is the most accurate first answer from Gilly. Gilly moves into solid possession of 3rd place.
Let's rock!
So, that'll do it for tonight. Appreciate you all playing. I know the quiz can be a little subjective as to what I'm looking for. Hopefully we're not frustrating anybody with that. It's designed to be fun. The prize at the end is, if you win, you get to pick something from the merch store. I may expand that, though, because Rocket's running away with it right now. I'm awake now. Good grenades, everybody. Thank you all for hanging out and participating tonight. To stay with the music, we're going to go see Kev again because he seems to be who streams at the same time that we're wrapping up each week. So, for those of you that are unfamiliar, Kev the Bunker is a Canadian musician. He's playing from what he calls the bunker. He's a cool guy. He'll play your requests. He has a song list, so make sure that you guys hang out for a little while, listen to what he's playing. He's probably almost surely going to put Sleeping Sickness by City and Color to the top of the list when we roll in there with a raid, because he knows I love that song. And we're going to go over and see Kev. So, thank you all for being here tonight. We're going to get out of here. Don't forget to check out All Dustin Monday through Saturday, 7:30 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. On Saturday, sometimes with Perm playing Borderlands. I really appreciate you all being out here tonight. There's Permanoob, Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. There's Gilly. Random nights starting at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, including the weekend. Make sure you're clicking those links and dropping follows. There's Rocket. He streamed this week. Today, I think. Tuesdays and Thursdays. Happy birthday, by the way, to both Rocket and Gilly, who celebrated their birthday this week, and to Sparky, who's not here, but he also had a birthday the same day as Rocket. There's Sturf. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time-ish. Currently playing Valheim and Ashen. Whoop you for free. Be excellent to each other. Indeed. There's the Omega Tuesday, Thursday nights around 8 p.m. for Extra Life. There's an Extra Life link down in the panels if you want to donate directly, but save it for a stroke stream. You can scare the crap up.
Be excellent to each other.